Hello, and welcome to the Minnesota Department of Health's webinar on the basics of climate projection data. I'm Brenda Hoppe, a research scientist with the Minnesota Department of Health's Climate and Health Program. And for nearly a decade, our program has been studying and addressing climate change impacts on human health and well-being, long enough that we've seen a lot of progress in this area. Helping to fuel this progress are the great advancements that have occurred around climate projection data. This presentation was originally shared at the first meeting of the Minnesota Climate Data Community of Practice. This community of practice is an open, active group intended to help steward the use of climate information for advancing resiliency planning throughout Minnesota's various state and local agencies. You can learn more about this community of practice as well as other activities led by the Minnesota Climate and Health Program at our website listed here. The goal of this webinar is to provide data users in Minnesota with a brief introduction to climate projection data. But first, I'd like you to keep in mind the broader context for this powerful source of information. We are at a pivotal moment in the growth of our understanding of climate change, specifically with regard to climate and computer science, which are offering us, through the provisioning of climate projection data, a dramatic shortcut to climate resiliency. Use of climate projection data in analysis and planning will not only help us prepare for the harsh realities of climate change, but will provide the foundation for cross-cutting innovations and truly inventive policies that otherwise may have been slow to evolve without the pressure of climate change. As an environmental public health scientist, I think of this point in our history and the potential impact of climate projection data, much like the moment in the mid-19th century when Louis Pasteur discovered that organisms invisible to the human eye can cause fatal diseases. Pasteur launched the field of microbiology, and with it came a burst of microbial data that allowed us to identify and prevent the transmission of bacteria through our water, air, and food that were the leading killers of the era. Microbiology gave us data that allowed us to see and address hidden threats in our environment. Climate projection data carry that same potential, the potential to see into places that were previously hidden to us. This time, that hidden place is the future. Simply put, climate projection data allow us to see and address the hidden threats of climate changes that may occur in our future. So what are climate projection data, and why are these data sets such a big deal? In a nutshell, climate projection data are estimates of future temperature and precipitation measures or other climate characteristics like solar radiation or wind speed that are derived from very sophisticated global climate models for time periods many decades into the future. Not only do these models capture the fundamental mechanisms of our planet related to physics, chemistry, and biology, but they also incorporate a range of possible greenhouse gas emission scenarios, potential technology or population changes, and their influence on all of these natural mechanisms. Without a crystal ball, model simulation of our future climate is really the only method that allows us to study how the climate may respond to increasing levels of greenhouse gases and their disruption on weather patterns and ecosystem responses. So let's unpack a little bit how these models work and what's inside of them. Climate models, also known as general circulation models or GCMs, use highly detailed mathematical equations to characterize how energy and matter interact in different parts of the ocean, atmosphere, and land. Building and running a climate model is a very complex process of identifying and quantifying Earth system processes, representing them with mathematical equations, setting variables to represent initial conditions and subsequent changes, and repeatedly solving these equations using very powerful supercomputers across time periods that stretch out to the end of the century. Climate models separate Earth's surface into a three-dimensional grid of cells that can interact with each other. The results of processes modeled for one cell is passed on to neighboring cells in order to model the exchange of matter and energy over time and over the Earth's entire surface. Generally speaking, grid cell size is what defines the resolution or the detail of the climate model. In other words, the smaller the size of the grid cell, the higher the level of detail in the model. Once the climate model is set up, it can be tested through a process called hindcasting or backtesting. Hindcasting involves running the model from the present backwards into the past. Model results are then compared with what was actually observed to see how accurately the model estimated those real-world observations. Science teams around the world are involved in building and testing climate models, comparing their model outputs to actual observations and also results from each other's models. Once a climate model is proven to perform well in hindcasting tests, in other words, once it is shown that it can represent past phenomena adequately, then it's considered valid for projecting what might occur in the future. And this is where things get interesting, because once you've designed a model that functions accurately, you can then tweak parts of that model or add new inputs to see how these disruptions or additions can impact the results. With regard to the influence of rising greenhouse gas emissions, you can add and change factors related to these emissions and project how well they may alter key climate variables like temperature, precipitation, wind speed, solar radiation, or cloud formation. Basically, you can start to create scenarios based on potential future levels of greenhouse gas emissions. So let's talk in a bit more detail about emission scenarios, because climate projection data are often packaged according to these scenarios. As I mentioned, there are a number of research groups around the world that develop climate models. To ensure that the results from these models are complementary and comparable, a standard set of greenhouse gas emission scenarios are used to ensure that starting conditions, historical data, and projections are used consistently across models. You can think of scenarios as packages of information that reflect the major factors that both influence and are influenced by greenhouse gas emissions. Back in 2000, the world's leading authority on climate change, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, issued its special report on emission scenarios, which described 4 scenarios that capture a range of possible climate futures. These were commonly referred to by letter number combinations such as A1, A2, B1, and B2. The series scenarios have been in use for more than a decade, and it's likely that you may have seen them referenced in reports or studies. In simple terms, the 4 scenarios represent divergent paths in the predominant drivers of climate emissions: economy, environment, globalization, and regionalization, and are characterized with data representing population changes, economic growth, technological advances, energy use, land use, and agriculture. So, for example, the A2 scenario and the data that populate it represent a future world characterized by increasing global population and technology advances that are fragmented and slow. You can see how this scenario correlates to higher emissions and a major increase in projected global temperatures over time. Conversely, the B1 scenario represents a world where global population peaks mid-century and then declines, with rapid changes toward a service and information economy, reductions in material consumption, and widespread adoption of clean technologies. These characteristics are linked to reductions in emissions and thus a more dampened increase in projected temperatures. However, as I mentioned, climate projections are in a rapid state of advancement, and in 2013, climate scientists agreed upon a new set of scenarios that are modeled a little differently than the old series scenarios. These new scenarios are known as representative concentration pathways, or RCPs, and they've replaced the old series scenarios as the gold standard for climate data selection. There are 4 RCP pathways: RCP 8.5, 6, 4.5, and 2.6. The numbers correspond to a range of radiative forcing represented as watts per square meter. Radiative forcing is a measure of the influence that emissions have on the Earth's energy balance. The rate and trajectory of the forcing is considered the pathway. Just like the previous series scenarios, RCPs likewise are based on different assumptions about population, economic growth, energy consumption, and land use over the century. However, the RCPs represent a wider set of futures than the previous series scenarios, and now explicitly include the effect of mitigation strategies. For example, RCP 2.6 represents a very ambitious mitigation scenario, with emissions peaking around 2020 and then rapidly declining. It assumes that global population peaks mid-century and that oil use declines and use of other fossil fuels is offset by widespread adoption of technologies for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. You can see how these factors lead to lower carbon dioxide levels and a lower rise in projected global temperatures. Conversely, RCP 8.5 represents a sort of worst-case scenario future in which emissions continue to increase rapidly, population growth stays high, while incomes and per capita growth in developing countries stay low. This scenario is highly energy intensive, assuming oil and coal use continues to grow rapidly, land use continues on current trends, with crop areas increasing and forest land decreasing. Here you can see how these factors lead to higher carbon dioxide levels and a much greater increase in projected global temperatures over the century. Now, I'd like to just briefly touch on a methodology that is central to the rapid advancement of climate projection data for state and local decision-making, and that methodology is referred to as downscaling. Downscaling output from global climate models involves incorporating local data and local models to increase the resolution or the detail of the original global climate model output. Downscaling really is a game changer because by increasing the granularity of climate data, improving how well the output from global models represents climate locally, now makes these data applicable and useful for planning and risk assessment. There are two main approaches to downscaling, statistical and dynamical. Dynamical downscaling relies on the use of regional climate models, or RCMs, driven by GCM output to produce highly regionalized climate information. In contrast, statistical downscaling uses statistical relationships to predict regional climate variables from large-scale variables. Each downscaling method has its strengths and weaknesses. Statistical downscaling is less computationally demanding and can be more easily applied, but it requires long-term, high-quality surface observations to establish a robust statistical relationship between large-scale variables and local variables. Dynamical downscaling involves the use of regional models that characterize highly detailed physical processes in a local area, and therefore can be much more highly resolved, but it's also more computationally expensive. Regardless of the approach, downscaled climate projection data are essential tools that we need to inform effective climate resiliency planning. Our program gained some experience with climate projection data while conducting a vulnerability assessment on private wells. For this assessment, the Climate and Health Program worked closely with the Minnesota State Climatology Office to characterize the potential for increased nitrate contamination pressures on Minnesota private wells from flooding linked to changes in heavy rainfall events. Application of precipitation projection data was central to this project. Briefly, for this vulnerability assessment, we combined precipitation projection data from the USGS's National Climate Change Viewer for Minnesota counties, along with data representing determinants of population vulnerability, such as exposure and sensitivity, to derive a composite vulnerability index, all in a GIS platform. This index allowed for easy mapping of areas in the state where nitrate contamination from flooding may put certain susceptible populations, particularly infants, at risk for health outcomes like methemoglobinemia from future increases in heavy rain events. There were a number of important lessons that we learned about climate projection data during this study, which we outline in our paper. But above all, the experience helped us realize the fundamental necessity of these data for crafting smart climate resiliency strategies. Already, there are a number of nations, even a few U.S. states, that have partnered with expert modelers to obtain downscaled data specific to their regions, and they're using these data across numerous sectors to advance innovative resiliency work for their citizens. For example, in 2016, Massachusetts governor signed an executive order that enabled funding for modelers with the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center to develop downscaled projections for future changes in temperature, precipitation, and sea level rise specific to Massachusetts. These data are publicly available through the Resilient Massachusetts Data Portal. California has CalAdapt, a similar online geospatial data tool where anyone can access localized climate change projections for the state produced by California's own scientific and research community. CalAdapt is currently the gold standard for the provision of climate projection data. An end user can get projections related to temperature, precipitation, and sea level rise, as well as snowpack, drought, wildfire, and stream flows. So how about Minnesota and our own quest to obtain climate projection data downscaled for our state? In fact, there are a number of groups and individuals from both the private and public sector that have spent years trying to find the policy and funding levers to enable development, access, and practical use of climate projection data for advancing resiliency strategies in Minnesota. Groups like the Minnesota Resiliency Collaborative continue to advocate for these data, but until Minnesota joins the ranks of Massachusetts and California, we can still grow our knowledge base in this area and help one another utilize what data are available through the Minnesota Climate Data Community of Practice. The Minnesota Climate and Health Program convened this COP to connect diverse data users with climate scientists working in Minnesota to share insights for obtaining, preparing, and applying climate projection data in various disciplines, to brainstorm solutions for overcoming challenges, establish consensus over use and interpretation of these data, and ultimately to further cross-agency, cross-disciplinary collaborations in Minnesota around climate resiliency. The Minnesota Climate Data Community of Practice is open to all, but particularly to state and local agency data users. For information on the next COP meeting or to learn more about projects and activities with the Minnesota Climate and Health Program, please sign up for our newsletter on our website. And with that, I thank you so much for your time and interest in climate projection data. I encourage you to stay in touch, and I wish you a very wonderful day.